In the annals of European history, few figures have captured the imagination quite like Empress Elisabeth of Austria. Known affectionately as Sisi, her story is not one of triumphant reign or political achievement, but rather a haunting tale of beauty, obsession, and devastating personal tragedy. What began as a fairy tale romance with Emperor Franz Joseph transformed into a lifetime of heartbreak, isolation, and the devastating loss of her 4 children. This is the story of a woman who had everything a woman in her position could desire, yet was robbed of the one thing that mattered most, the opportunity to protect those she loved. Her life reads like a tragic novel, too dark and depressing to be fiction, yet entirely painfully real. Before we begin this incredible journey into one of history's most tragic lives, we'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. We love connecting with our viewers from every corner of the globe. This channel is dedicated to telling the life stories of history's most remarkable women, and we're so grateful you're here. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We promise to bring you more powerful, fascinating stories of historic women regularly. So don't miss out, subscribe now and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Now, let's dive into the tragic and extraordinary life of Empress Elisabeth Sisi. Chapter 1: The Girl Before the Crown. Elizabeth Amalie Eugenie was born on December 24th, 1837, into the Bavarian ducal family as the daughter of Duke Maximilian II of Bavaria and Princess Ludovica. She was not born to be an empress. The Bavarian ducals were respectable but far from the highest echelon of European nobility. Yet this mischievous girl with chestnut hair and dark eyes would become one of history's most iconic and tragic figures. The Bavarian court of the 1830s was vastly different from the rigid, formal courts of Vienna or Berlin. Munich in this era was a cultural hub, a place where intellectuals and artists gathered, where new ideas were discussed, and where the atmosphere was considerably more relaxed than in the major imperial centers of Europe. Duke Maximilian II was himself part of this intellectual renaissance. He was not merely a monarch in the traditional sense, but a genuine scholar and patron of the arts who took his role as a cultivated gentleman seriously. He corresponded with philosophers, collected rare books, and spent considerable time reading and writing. He embodied the ideals of the Enlightenment reason, individual thought, and the pursuit of knowledge. Princess Ludovica, Elizabeth's mother, came from a different mold entirely. She was a daughter of King Maximilian I Joseph of Bavaria and represented the more traditional, practical side of Bavarian nobility. While she respected her husband's intellectual pursuits, she was primarily concerned with the practical matters of running a household and raising children according to proper protocols. Yet even Ludovica, by the standards of the time, was relatively progressive. She believed in education for her daughters at a time when many European courts relegated women to merely ornamental roles. The tension between Maximilian's romantic idealism and Ludovica's practical traditionalism would profoundly shape Elizabeth's personality. Young Elizabeth grew up in an atmosphere of remarkable freedom compared to the rigid protocols of major European courts. She was not cloistered in a palace, surrounded by stern governesses and formal protocols. Rather, her childhood was relatively informal and filled with outdoor activity and intellectual stimulation. Her father took a direct interest in her education and encouraged her to read, to think, and to form her own opinions, revolutionary concepts for a girl of her era. Elizabeth spent her childhood riding horses across the Bavarian countryside with a freedom that would have shocked the mothers of other European princesses. She was an exceptional horsewoman from a very young age, and the skill born of long hours in the saddle, learning to control powerful animals, pushing her body to physical limits, would become one of her defining characteristics. She was not a delicate, carefully managed princess, but rather a spirited, athletic girl who was allowed to develop her body and her will according to her own inclinations. Her father encouraged her love of literature and poetry from her earliest years. The ducal library became her refuge and her playground. She devoured books voraciously, not just the approved literature for young ladies, but poetry, philosophy, history, and literature from across Europe. She became fluent in multiple languages: German, English, Italian, and Hungarian, not through formal, rigid instruction, but because she was genuinely interested in reading works in their original languages. She could read Goethe and Schiller in German, Shakespeare in English, Dante in Italian. By her teenage years, she had become genuinely educated in a way that few women of her time were allowed to be. This education went beyond mere linguistic ability. Through her reading, Elisabeth developed a deeply romantic worldview. She absorbed the ideals of Romanticism, the belief in the primacy of emotion and intuition, the celebration of nature and the individual, the conviction that true love was the highest good. That passionate feeling was more important than social obligation. She read the great love stories of literature and believed in them absolutely. She believed in destiny and soulmates, in the transformative power of true love. These convictions, imbibed through years of reading and contemplation, would profoundly shape her understanding of her own life. Her father's influence particularly shaped her worldview. Duke Maximilian was a romantic in his own way, a man who believed in the power of culture and intellectual pursuit to improve human existence. He modeled for Elisabeth the idea that a person, even a person of high station, could pursue intellectual and spiritual development, could think independently, could question conventional wisdom. He spent time with his daughter, discussing books and ideas with her as if she were an adult capable of serious thought. This treatment was extraordinary for a girl of her era and imbued her with a sense of her own intellectual worth. Yet her mother's influence was equally important, though in a different way. Ludovique provided stability, structure, and a grounding in practical reality. She insisted that Elisabeth develop the skills necessary to function in society: dancing, deportment, needlework, the management of a household. But even as she taught Elisabeth these traditional feminine accomplishments, Ludovica was aware that her daughter was unusual. She must have sensed that Elisabeth's exceptional beauty and her unusual combination of intellectual sophistication and romantic idealism made her vulnerable to fantasy, to unrealistic expectations about life and love. By her mid-teenage years, Elisabeth had blossomed into a strikingly beautiful young woman. But her beauty was not merely physical, though her dark, luminous eyes, her full lips, and her graceful, athletic figure certainly attracted notice from everyone who met her. Rather, her beauty was more fundamentally about her entire presence. She moved with a naturalness and grace that came from years of physical activity. She spoke with intelligence and wit that demonstrated her education. She had a kind of luminous quality, a radiance that came from within, that seemed to promise something indefinable and romantic. What truly set Elisabeth apart was her spirit. She was witty, educated, artistic, and possessed an almost palpable romantic idealism about life and love. She was not cynical or worldly wise, as a girl of her position might have become through exposure to court society. Rather, she seemed to believe absolutely in the possibility of genuine love, and the idea that a person could marry not for political advantage, but because of true feeling. She believed in beauty, in nature, and the transformative power of human connection. She embodied Romanticism not as a literary movement, but as a way of living and understanding the world. This combination of qualities, exceptional beauty, genuine education, romantic idealism, spirited independence, was utterly captivating. Everyone who met Elisabeth in these years fell under her spell. She seemed to promise a kind of happiness and authenticity that most of the people in rigid court society can never imagine. She represented freedom, genuine feeling, and the possibility that life could be more than mere duty and protocol. As Elizabeth entered her late teenage years, she lived in a kind of golden innocence. She was beautiful, admired, educated, and she inhabited a world that celebrated her for these qualities. She had no idea that her exceptional beauty and her romantic idealism, the very qualities that made her so beloved in the Bavarian court, would become sources of profound suffering when she encountered the rigid structures of the imperial court. She had no idea that her love of freedom and her need for intellectual and spiritual development would be constantly thwarted by the relentless protocols of imperial life. She did not know that she would be forced to surrender her children to another woman's care, that she would experience the agony of separation from her own offspring, that she would spend decades in a kind of psychological exile from her own family. She could not have imagined the tragedy that awaited her, the suicide of her only son, the estrangement from her daughters, her own descent into obsession and despair. In these innocent years, she was simply a beautiful, spirited girl living in a cultured court, reading her beloved poetry, riding her horses across the Bavarian countryside, dreaming romantic dreams about the life that awaited her. She had no way of knowing that the dreams she harbored of true love, of authentic connection, of freedom and happiness, would become the source of her deepest anguish. The girl who believed so completely in the power of love and feeling would become a woman whose love for her own children would be denied by the very system that had raised her. But for now, in the years before 1853, Elizabeth was happy. She was young, she was beautiful, and she had not yet encountered the forces that would destroy her. These innocent years, these final years before her life was irrevocably changed, are precious in retrospect. They represent the last time Elizabeth would be truly free, the last time her romantic idealism would be untested by the harsh realities of imperial duty. Soon, everything would change. Soon, the beautiful, spirited girl would be thrust into a world that would systematically destroy everything that made her who she was. But for now, in the safety of the Bavarian court, she was simply Sisi, beautiful, intelligent, free, and utterly innocent of what lay ahead. Chapter 2: The Fateful Journey to Vienna. To understand what happened during that fateful summer of 1853, we must first understand Emperor Franz Joseph I. He was born on August 18, 1830, and had become emperor in 1848 at the remarkably young age of 18, during a period of tremendous upheaval and revolution across Europe. The revolutions of 1848 had threatened the very foundations of the Habsburg dynasty, and Franz Joseph had been thrust into the role of absolute ruler at a moment when his empire seemed to be teetering on the brink of collapse. By the time he turned 23 in 1853, Franz Joseph had already endured 5 years of intense pressure, complex political maneuvering, and the enormous responsibility of governing one of Europe's largest and most diverse empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched across much of Central Europe and included peoples of multiple nationalities, languages, and religions. It was an empire held together not by ethnic or linguistic unity, but by the absolute authority of the Habsburg dynasty and the unquestionable loyalty of the imperial court. Franz Joseph himself was a man shaped entirely by duty and obligation. He had been trained from birth to be emperor, educated to understand that his personal desires were irrelevant compared to the needs of the state. He was handsome in the formal way that emperors often are tall, with penetrating blue eyes and strong features that conveyed authority and power. But more than handsome, he carried about him the absolute certainty of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. He was accustomed to obedience, to deference, to having his every whim fulfilled instantly. Yet for all his power, Franz Joseph was curiously emotionally underdeveloped. He had been raised in an environment of rigid protocol, separated from normal human connection, educated into a role rather than nurtured as a human being. He had little understanding of genuine emotion or authentic human connection. His relationships with people were transactional. They served the state, or they served him, or they did not matter. He was capable of what he believed was love, but it was a love based on possession and control, rather than on genuine understanding or empathy. The true power behind Franz Joseph, however, was not the emperor himself, but his mother, the Archduchess Sophia of Bavaria. Sophia was one of the most formidable women of the 19th century, a woman of extraordinary intelligence, ruthlessness, and will. She had married Archduke Franz Charles of Austria and produced Franz Joseph, but more importantly, she had positioned herself as the true power behind the throne. Sophia was obsessed with maintaining the prestige and power of the House of Habsburg. She believed absolutely that the empire needed strong, disciplined leadership, and she had made it her life's mission to ensure that Franz Joseph would embody that leadership. She had been instrumental in his education, in his political training, and in his rise to power. She saw herself as the guardian of Habsburg glory and was determined that nothing and no one would undermine the empire as strength or her son as absolute authority. By 1853, Sophia was in her early 50s and had spent the previous 5 years carefully orchestrating a marriage for her son. She had examined princesses from across Europe, evaluating them not for inequalities they might have as individuals, but solely for their political utility and their suitability as brood Murrays for producing heirs. The ideal candidate, in Sophia's mind, would be politically advantageous, older than Franz Joseph, and therefore established in court life, properly trained in imperial protocols, and, most importantly, appropriately submissive and controllable. She had settled on Elizabeth's older sister Helene as the perfect candidate. Helene was 3 years older than Elizabeth, more established in court life, and appeared to have the proper temperament for the role. Sophia had orchestrated an invitation for the Bavarian ducal family to visit Ischl specifically so that she could evaluate Helene up close and finalize the arrangements for the engagement. Ischl was the imperial summer residence, a place where the emperor and the court retired during the warm months. It was beautiful, nestled in the Alpine foothills, with mountains rising around it and the Traun River flowing nearby. It was a place designed for relaxation and yet also a place where court protocols remained firmly in place. Every meal was formal, every interaction was prescribed. Even in this supposedly more relaxed setting, the rigid hierarchies and careful etiquette of the imperial court were maintained. In August 1853, Elizabeth and her sister Helene, along with their parents, arrived at Ischl. Elizabeth was just 16 years old, young, beautiful, spirited, and utterly unprepared for what awaited her. She understood, of course, that the visit was not entirely casual. Her mother had explained to her that Helene was being considered as a potential bride for the emperor, but Elizabeth was not the focus of attention. She was merely accompanying her sister, a supporting player in a drama that centered on Helene. Helene was nervous and excited. This was her opportunity to become Empress of Austria, to fulfill a role that would bring honor and prestige to her family. She was properly decorous, appropriately modest, and displayed all the correct courtly behaviors. She would make, everyone agreed, an excellent empress. And then Franz Joseph saw Elizabeth. The accounts vary slightly in their details, but all agree on the essential fact. When Emperor Franz Joseph first laid eyes on the 16-year-old Elizabeth, something happened that no one had anticipated. He was attending a gathering in the gardens of Ischl, where the Bavarian guests were being formally introduced. Helene was presented to him, and he was polite, gracious, and properly interested. And then Elizabeth entered, and the world, for Franz Joseph, changed. According to contemporary accounts, Elizabeth was dressed simply but elegantly. She moved with a natural grace that came from years of outdoor activity. Her dark eyes seemed to look directly into his soul. There was something about her that was utterly different from the carefully trained, protocol-conscious princesses he had known. There was something wild, something authentic, something genuine about her that he found absolutely irresistible. More importantly, Elizabeth possessed something that Helene did not: mystery. Helene was transparent, easily understood, appropriate, and correct. Elizabeth was enigmatic, full of hidden depths, passionate, and idealistic in ways that were utterly foreign to the rigid world of the imperial court. For a man who had spent his entire life in a world of rigid control and prescribed behavior, Elizabeth represented something intoxicating, the promise of authentic feeling, of genuine connection, of something real beneath the endless protocols and formalities. Franz Joseph was captivated. Within moments, he had effectively forgotten about Helene. He repositioned himself to stand near Elizabeth. He began to pay her devoted attention. He looked at her with an intensity and passion that was utterly unmistakable. The court noticed immediately. The Archduchess Sophie noticed. Everyone noticed. After that first encounter in the gardens, Franz Joseph and Elizabeth saw each other constantly during the remaining days of the Bavarian family's visit to Ischl. The emperor was utterly infatuated. He sought her out at every opportunity. He arranged for her to ride horses with him, perhaps the activity in which Elizabeth felt most at home and most herself. He spent hours in conversation with her, discussing books, poetry, and philosophy. For Elizabeth, these moments were intoxicating. Here was a man who seemed genuinely interested in her mind, not just her beauty. Here was a man of absolute power who deferred to her opinions and seemed genuinely moved by her words. But more importantly, for the first time in her life, Elizabeth felt truly seen. Franz Joseph looked at her as if she was the most important person in the world. His attention was absolute and undivided. In those days at Ischl, she felt that she had found what she had been searching for, someone who loved her for who she truly was, not despite her spirited nature, but because of it. She did not realize that what Franz Joseph loved was his fantasy of her, not the real Elizabeth. She did not understand that she had been chosen not because of her true self, but because of her surface beauty and her apparent innocence. She did not understand that the emperor's passion was based not on who she really was, but on his fantasy of who she was. Elizabeth's mother and sister watched this drama unfold with a mixture of emotions. Ludovica was practical enough to understand that this was a far greater opportunity than a match with Helene would have been. Elizabeth would not merely be empress, she would be the woman the emperor truly loved, or so it seemed. Helene, after the initial shock of having her opportunity upended, adapted with grace. She was relieved in some ways that she would not have to bear the weight of being the empress the emperor felt obligated to marry. Within days of that first meeting, Franz Joseph had made his intentions clear. He wanted to marry Elizabeth, not Helene, not any of the other carefully evaluated candidates. Elizabeth, the Archduchess Sophie, was absolutely appalled. Her carefully laid plans had been completely upended. She had spent months evaluating Helene, arranging the visit, preparing for the announcement of an engagement that would satisfy all of her political calculations. And now her son, the Emperor of Austria, was infatuated with a 16-year-old girl who had absolutely no court experience, who was known for her wild, independent spirit, who would be, in Sophie's view, completely uncontrollable and unsuitable for the role of empress. She attempted to reason with Franz Joseph. She explained to him the political advantages of Helene. She outlined the disadvantages of Elizabeth. She pointed out that Elizabeth was too young, too inexperienced, too spirited and independent. She tried everything: logic, political argument, maternal persuasion. But Franz Joseph, for perhaps the first time in his life, refused to be controlled by his mother. He was absolutely determined to marry Elizabeth. And in this, he had one great advantage. He was the Emperor of Austria. What Franz Joseph wanted, Franz Joseph would have. The news spread through the court like wildfire. The Archduchess Sophie's face, when she learned of the engagement, must have been a sight to behold. Her son, the Emperor of Austria, had defied her and chosen a girl she considered wholly unsuitable, yet there was nothing she could do. Franz Joseph had made his decision, and his word was absolute. Within hours, the news was being transmitted throughout the empire. The engagement of Emperor Franz Joseph to Elisabeth of Bavaria was official. In the weeks and months that followed, elaborate plans were made for the wedding. It would take place in Vienna, in the Augustinian church, on April 24th, 1854. It would be the grandest imperial wedding of the century. The entire empire would celebrate the union of the emperor with his bride. Money was spent lavishly on preparations. Hundreds of workers labored to prepare Vienna for the festivities. Elizabeth's wedding dress was commissioned from Vienna's finest seamstress and would be made of the most exquisite materials. Elizabeth, meanwhile, began her education in what it meant to be Empress of Austria. The Archduchess Sophie took it upon herself to personally supervise this education. She taught Elizabeth the rigid protocols of the imperial court, the endless rules of etiquette, the proper way to address various members of the nobility, the complex hierarchy of the court. She explained to Elizabeth that being empress was not about personal happiness or individual desires. It was about duty, honor, and the perpetuation of the Habsburg dynasty. These lessons must have been jarring for Elizabeth. The freedom she had known in Bavaria, the intellectual freedom her father had encouraged, the ability to ride horses and read poetry and speak her mind, all of this was being systematically trained out of her. She was being prepared to be an empress, which meant she was being trained to suppress her own personality, to submit to rigid protocols, to understand that her personal desires were meaningless compared to the needs of the state. Yet Elizabeth accepted these lessons with the enthusiasm of youth. She was still in love with the idea of being the emperor's bride. She was still convinced that her love for Franz Joseph and his love for her would be enough to sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. She did not understand that the education Sophie was giving her was not preparation for happiness, but rather training for a kind of beautiful imprisonment. The journey from Ischl to Vienna would be Elizabeth's last days of freedom. Once she entered the imperial court as empress, once she was bound by the protocols and obligations of her position, she would never again experience the freedom she had known in Bavaria. The girl who had ridden horses across the countryside, who had read whatever books she wanted, who had been encouraged to think independently and speak her mind, that girl would cease to exist. She would be replaced by a role, a function, an empress. In those final days before her wedding, Elizabeth was happy. She was young, she was beautiful, and she was in love, or so she believed. She had no way of knowing that she was walking toward a magnificent, gilded cage from which she would never truly escape. The fairy tale was about to end, and the tragedy was about to begin. She did not know that the man she had fallen in love with was a man shaped entirely by duty and protocol, incapable of providing the emotional warmth and understanding she desperately needed. She did not know that the woman who would control her life, the Archduchess Sophie, viewed her not as a human being deserving of love and respect, but as a valuable tool for producing heirs to continue the Habsburg line. She did not know that the freedom she had taken for granted would be systematically stripped away, replaced by endless protocols, rigid etiquette, and the absolute subordination of her own desires to the needs of the empire. In those final golden days before her wedding, Elizabeth believed that her fairy tale had come true. The beautiful, spirited girl from Bavaria, who had spent her childhood reading romantic poetry and dreaming of true love, believed that she had found exactly what she had been looking for. She had no idea that the very thing she believed she had found, authentic love, genuine connection, freedom to be herself, would be the first thing taken from her when she entered the imperial court of Vienna. But for now, in that golden moment, she was happy. She was young, she was beautiful, and she was utterly innocent of what lay ahead. Chapter 3. The Empress Reluctant. On April 24th, 1854, Elizabeth married Franz Joseph in an elaborate ceremony in Vienna's Augustinian church. The young bride was only 16 years old, dressed in an exquisite white gown adorned with intricate lace and pearl embroidery, her dark hair crowned with orange blossoms, the traditional flower of imperial brides. The dress had taken months to create and cost a fortune in materials alone. The ceremony was the grandest Vienna had seen in decades, a spectacle designed to demonstrate the power and prestige of the Habsburg dynasty. Thousands of people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of their new empress. Church bells rang throughout the city for hours. The ceremony itself lasted over 3 hours, filled with elaborate rituals, prayers, and ancient Habsburg traditions. Cardinals and bishops conducted the service. Nobility from across Europe attended. The emperor and his young bride processed through Vienna afterward in an open carriage so that the people could see them. Guards on horseback surrounded them, controlling the jubilant crowds who pressed forward to see the beautiful empress. Vienna erupted in celebration unlike anything the city had seen in years. The newspapers printed detailed descriptions of Elizabeth's beauty, her grace, her apparent happiness. Artists began painting her portrait. Songs were written celebrating the marriage. The people fell in love with their young empress, this girl who embodied beauty, grace, and romantic promise. She was not the stern, formal empress they might have expected from the rigid Habsburg tradition, but rather a radiant young woman who seemed genuinely happy, who smiled, who appeared to be deeply in love with her new husband. For the first time in decades, Vienna had an empress who was not merely a political necessity, but a person the people could love. Elizabeth herself was euphoric. She was only 16 years old, had married the most powerful man in Europe, and was now Empress of Austria-Hungary. She believed absolutely that her life was beginning in earnest, that her fairy tale dream had become reality. She was convinced that her love for Franz Joseph and his love for her would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first few weeks after the wedding, Elizabeth experienced something close to happiness. Franz Joseph seemed devoted to her. He showed her the imperial palaces. He spent time with her. He appeared to genuinely care for her well-being. Elizabeth believed that the difficult preparations with the Archduchess Sophie had been worth it. She believed that she had truly found her soulmate, that she and Franz Joseph would have a marriage based on love rather than mere political necessity. But this golden period was brief. It lasted perhaps a few weeks before the reality of Imperial Vienna began to settle in like a suffocating fog. The honeymoon period ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The Archduchess, Sophie so furious at being displaced from her son's primary affections and bitter about her plan to marry him too. Helene, being upended, turned her considerable will toward controlling and molding the new empress into a proper Habsburg wife. She had not been able to prevent the marriage, but she was absolutely determined that Elizabeth would understand the true nature of her position and her duties. Sophie began by establishing strict protocols for Elizabeth's daily life. Every aspect of her existence became prescribed and controlled. What time she must wake, what she must eat, how she must dress, which guests she could receive, when she could see her husband, what she could say and to whom. The young bride, raised with freedom and independence in the relatively liberal Bavarian court, found herself suddenly trapped in a suffocating gilded cage where every movement was prescribed, every word was scrutinized, and every action reflected upon the imperial honor. Elizabeth had been educated and sophisticated, but she had never been trained in the specific protocols of the imperial Habsburg court. The rules were countless, complex, and arcane. There were rules about how to address different members of the nobility, rules about which doors to use in which parts of the palace, rules about how to walk, how to sit, how to hold her head. Rules about what topics of conversation were appropriate. Rules about how often she should appear in public and under what circumstances. The Archduchess Sophie personally supervised Elizabeth's education in these protocols. She was not kind. When Elizabeth made mistakes, and she made many, Sophie corrected her sharply, publicly humiliating her in front of members of the court. Elizabeth's natural grace and intelligence, which had served her so well in Bavaria, were suddenly liabilities. Her willingness to speak her mind was seen as inappropriate. Her desire to ride horses and exercise freely was considered unladylike. The very qualities that had made her so appealing to Franz Joseph were being systematically suppressed and eliminated. Elizabeth had imagined that her love for Franz Joseph and his love for her would be enough to sustain her through these challenges. She had believed that within the rigid constraints of the court, they would find personal moments of genuine connection and warmth. But she quickly and painfully discovered that within the imperial court, personal feelings were largely irrelevant. The court cared only about duty, protocol, and the perpetuation of the dynasty. Franz Joseph, it became clear, was not the romantic lover she had fallen in love with at Ischl. Rather, he was a man utterly consumed by his role as emperor. His days were filled with state business, meetings with ministers, military matters, and political crises. He was kind to Elizabeth in his limited way, but he was incapable of providing the emotional warmth and understanding she desperately needed. He had been raised to believe that emotions were weaknesses to be overcome, that duty and obligation were the only things that mattered. He could not comfort his wife because he had never been comforted himself. He could not offer genuine emotional connection because he had been trained from birth to see such things as irrelevant to his purpose. Elizabeth found herself alone in Vienna, surrounded by hundreds of people, living in a vast palace, yet utterly isolated. She had lost her family, her home, her freedom, and her sense of self. The girl who had spent her days reading poetry and riding horses across the Bavarian countryside was now confined to formal ceremonies, endless protocols, and the constant surveillance of the Archduchess Sophie. More troubling still was Elizabeth's new role as breeder of heirs. She became pregnant almost immediately after the wedding. She was barely 17 years old. The joy she felt at first at carrying Franz Joseph's child was quickly tempered by the grim reality of childbirth in an age without modern medicine and by her terrible consuming fear of what would happen to her body. In 19th century Europe, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women in their reproductive years. Every pregnancy was a serious medical risk. Women regularly died from infection, hemorrhage, complications from anesthesia, or any number of unforeseen problems. The doctors of the time had only a crude understanding of what could go wrong during childbirth, and even fewer tools to address complications if they arose. Women were expected to endure their labors alone, often for days, with minimal pain relief. The survival of both mother and child was never guaranteed. Elizabeth had received no preparation for the physical ordeal ahead. She was terrified. She could only wait, growing larger day by day, watching her beautiful body transform, knowing that the pain and danger ahead would be immense. She was acutely aware that childbirth could kill her. She knew women who had died in childbirth. She understood that at 17, her body was not fully mature for the ordeal she would have to endure. More devastating still was her complete awareness that her value in the court, the only value she seemed to possess, was based entirely on her ability to produce heirs. If she failed in this task, if she died giving birth, if she was unable to bear children, she would be worse than useless. She would be a failure. The Archduchess Sophie made this abundantly clear through her actions and her words. She watched Elizabeth constantly, evaluating her, waiting for Elizabeth to prove herself inadequate to the task. Elizabeth understood that her worth as Empress depended entirely on her ability to bear sons. Chapter 4. The First Child. Archduchess Sophie. As spring arrived in Vienna in 1855, Elizabeth's pregnancy had consumed nearly a year of her life as empress. The 9 months had been filled with anxiety, fear, and physical discomfort. She had been confined mostly to the palace, forbidden to ride horses or engage in the vigorous exercise she loved. Her body, once lithe and athletic, had become heavy and cumbersome. She felt imprisoned in her own flesh. By early March, her labor was imminent. The court physicians gathered. Special rooms were prepared. Servants moved nervously through the palace. The entire empire was waiting to hear whether Elizabeth would deliver a son or a daughter. A male heir would secure the succession. A daughter, while valuable for making political alliances through marriage, would disappoint the empire, which hungered for a strong male to carry on the Habsburg name. Elizabeth's labor began on March 4th and lasted through the night into March 5th. The pain was excruciating. She had received no preparation, no education about what to expect. The doctors and midwives of the time, despite their formal education, understood very little about the physiology of childbirth or how to effectively manage the agony that accompanied it. Elizabeth was given minimal pain relief, some laudanum, perhaps, and alcohol, but nothing that would truly ease her suffering. She was expected to endure it as all women did. The labor went on for many hours, 18, 20, 24. Elizabeth's body was racked with contractions that came closer and closer together. She screamed. She cried. She felt as though her body was being torn apart from the inside. The midwives whispered to each other, sometimes looking concerned. The doctors conferred in hushed voices. Hours passed. More hours. The clock ticked forward into the morning of March 5th. Finally, after nearly 30 hours of labor, Elizabeth delivered a daughter. Sophie Maria Theresia was born exhausted, covered in vernix, with her mother equally exhausted and bloodied from the ordeal. Elizabeth hemorrhaged heavily. She lost enormous quantities of blood. The doctors were alarmed. For a time, it was not clear whether Elizabeth would survive. At 17 years old, having just endured the most traumatic physical experience of her life, Elizabeth nearly died. When news of the birth spread through Vienna, the reaction was muted. A daughter. The empire had hoped for a son. The Archduchess Sophie made no effort to hide her disappointment. Franz Joseph was polite but clearly let down. A male heir would have cemented the succession in a way a daughter could not. A daughter would have to be married off to some other European prince to strengthen diplomatic alliances. She was valuable, certainly, but not in the way the empire had hoped. Elizabeth, in her exhausted, bleeding, traumatized state, heard the disappointment in people's voices. She sensed it in the way visitors spoke to her with kindness, but with an undertone of pity. They had a girl. Another girl would not rule the empire. Another girl could not prevent a succession crisis. The baby herself was beautiful. Sophie was born with pale skin and a shock of dark hair. She had Elizabeth's eyes, dark and luminous. But Elizabeth would barely have time to bond with her daughter before the child was taken away. In the imperial Habsburg court, there were traditions about how children were raised, or rather, about who was not allowed to raise them. Mothers, particularly young mothers who had just given birth and were emotionally vulnerable, were considered unsuitable as primary caregivers. The Archduchess Sophie, as the senior female member of the imperial family, and as someone with decades of experience managing the Habsburg household, took charge of the infant immediately. The Archduchess Sophie did not do this out of concern for Elizabeth's health, though she may have justified it in those terms. Rather, she did it because she wanted absolute control over the child's upbringing and education. A child raised by a young, romantic, somewhat rebellious mother like Elizabeth might develop ideas unsuitable for a Habsburg princess. A child raised by the Archduchess Sophie would be molded into the perfect imperial daughter, obedient, dutiful, and completely subservient to the needs of the dynasty. Following court tradition, Sophie removed the infant princess from Elizabeth's direct care. Elizabeth was not allowed to keep her daughter in her rooms. She was not allowed to nurse. Her wet nurses were employed for that. She was not allowed to have primary responsibility for the child's care, education, or upbringing. Elizabeth was relegated to supervise visits with her own daughter, supervised with her own child. Elizabeth was allowed perhaps an hour or two each day to see her daughter, and always under the watchful eye of the Archduchess Sophie or one of Sophie's trusted attendants. These visits were formal, stiff affairs. Elizabeth could not hold her daughter freely or comfort her as she wished. She could not teach her or hold her during the night when she cried. She could not be present at the milestone moments of her childhood, her first smile, her first word, her first steps. For Elizabeth, this separation was nothing short of devastating. She had endured 9 months of anxiety, 18 hours of excruciating labor, and nearly died in childbirth. She had survived all of this with the understanding, the unspoken promise, that she would have a daughter to love and raise. She had imagined motherhood as a source of profound meaning and purpose. She had imagined that in her role as mother, she might find the love and connection that her marriage could not provide. Instead, she discovered a terrible and cruel reality. In the imperial court, children were not the property of their mothers. Children belonged to the state. They were tools for perpetuating the dynasty. They were assets to be managed and controlled, not human beings to be loved and nurtured. Elizabeth had no authority over her own daughter. She could not make decisions about the child's education, her diet, her clothing, her daily schedule. All of those decisions were made by the Archduchess Sophie, the woman who had already caused Elizabeth so much suffering. The woman who had suppressed her freedom and her spirit was now also the primary caregiver of her child. The psychological impact of this separation was enormous and lasting. Elizabeth had held her daughter for perhaps a few moments after birth, before the child was taken away to be cleaned and prepared. That was effectively the last time she had any real control or connection with her own child. From that moment forward, Sophie Maria Theresia was the Archduchess's child, not Elizabeth's. Elizabeth fell into a deep depression in the weeks following Sophie's birth. She had survived a terrible ordeal, only to have the source of joy and meaning she had hoped for taken away from her. She was confined to bed during her recovery, weakened by blood loss and trauma. The Archduchess Sophie came to visit her, showed her the infant daughter briefly, and then took her away again. Elizabeth wept. She grieved not just the loss of her daughter, but the loss of her hope that motherhood might redeem her situation. She had imagined that perhaps, despite the difficulties of her marriage and the rigidity of the court, she might find profound joy and purpose in being a mother. She had imagined that her love for her children might be something that could sustain her, give her life meaning, help her endure the suffocation of imperial life. This loss was where Elizabeth's true tragedy began. Not at the moment of her marriage to Franz Joseph, though that marriage was a tragedy in many ways. Not at the moment of her first heartbreak at the Archduchess's cruelty, though that was devastating. But at this moment, when her newborn daughter was taken from her arms and placed under the control of another woman, this was when Elizabeth's real tragedy began. The grief she felt was absolute and unending. It would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had given her body, endured pain, nearly died, only to be denied even the most basic and fundamental human right, the right to mother her own child. Chapter 5. The Son and Heir, Crown Prince Rudolph. 3 years later, on August 21st, 1858, Elizabeth bore the son the empire had been waiting for. Crown Prince Rudolph was born amidst jubilation throughout the Austro-Hungarian realm. Vienna celebrated for days, church bells rang. The succession was secure. Franz Joseph was ecstatic. The Archduchess Sophie was satisfied. The empire had its heir. But for Elizabeth, Rudolph's arrival was bittersweet. Yes, she had delivered what the empire demanded, but the same pattern repeated. The Archduchess Sophie, even more invested in this precious male heir, immediately claimed him. Elizabeth was again relegated to supervise visits. Her body, weakened from childbirth, was forced again into the rigid structures of court life. She was expected to produce more heirs, to look beautiful for the emperor, to obey the Archduchess's endless rules, and to have no real authority over her own children. Rudolph, from his earliest moments, was being groomed to be emperor. He was educated separately from his mother, his daily life orchestrated by tutors and the Archduchess. He saw his mother only at prescribed times in formal settings. The bond between mother and son, which should have been one of tender love and connection, became distant and formal. This separation would have profound and tragic consequences decades later. More pregnancies followed in rapid succession. In 1856, Elizabeth suffered multiple miscarriages. The toll on her health was severe. Each pregnancy weakened her body further. Each birth took something from her. She lived in constant fear of pregnancy, fear of childbirth, fear of producing stillborn children, fear of losing her physical beauty, which had been her only source of power in the imperial court. Chapter 6. The other daughters, Gisela and Sophie. Sophie Maria Theresia, Elizabeth's firstborn child, entered the world on March 5, 1855, to profound disappointment. She was not the son the empire craved, but rather another daughter when males were desperately needed to secure the Habsburg succession. From the moment of her birth, Sophie's fate was sealed. She would be valuable primarily as a tool for diplomatic marriage, for creating alliances with other European powers, and for producing male heirs of her own. Sophie was immediately taken from her mother and placed under the complete control of the Archduchess Sophie. The irony was cruel. The child bore her grandmother's name, as if to symbolize her complete ownership by that formidable woman. As Sophie grew, she barely knew her own mother. Elizabeth was a distant figure who appeared only occasionally for formal visits, a beautiful phantom in black dresses who was present, but not present, who held no real authority or influence in her daughter's life. The Archduchess Sophie raised her granddaughter to be the perfect imperial princess. Every aspect of Sophie's education was designed to make her a valuable commodity on the marriage market. She was taught languages, not out of genuine intellectual curiosity, but because multilingual brides were more valuable diplomatically. She was trained in etiquette, in the proper way to walk and sit and speak, in how to manage a household, and how to fulfill her duty to the dynasty. She was taught that her feelings were irrelevant, that her personal happiness was insignificant compared to her duty to the empire. By the time Sophie was 18, a suitable match had been arranged. She would marry King Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies, a man decades older than she was, a king of a small Italian kingdom. The marriage was designed to strengthen Austrian influence in Italy and to secure a valuable alliance. Sophie had no choice in the matter. She obediently accepted the man who would be her husband and left Austria to begin her married life in Naples. Her life with Ferdinand II was unhappy almost from the beginning. She was a dutiful wife, she bore him children, she managed his household. She fulfilled every obligation required of her, but she was never happy. She suffered multiple miscarriages. She experienced the agony of child loss, just as her mother had. She lived in a foreign court where she was never fully accepted, always the Austrian princess, always an outsider. She spent her long life, she lived to be 80 years old, trying to be the perfect wife and Empress of Naples, never complaining, never rebelling, never finding genuine joy or fulfillment. Sophie would die in 1935, having lived a long but profoundly unhappy life. She was never close to her mother. She never experienced genuine maternal love from Elizabeth. She was raised to be a dynastic asset, and she lived and died as one, never truly living for herself or for her own happiness. In many ways, Sophie's quiet suffering was as tragic as her mother's more dramatic despair, though it garnered far less historical attention. Archduchess Gisela was born on July 12, 1856, just over a year after her sister Sophie. Like Sophie before her, she was another daughter when sons were desperately needed. The empire's disappointment was palpable. Gisela would also be separated from her mother immediately and placed under the Archduchess Sophie's strict control. She too would be educated not to think independently or to develop her own personality, but rather to be molded into a perfect imperial daughter who would fulfill whatever diplomatic marriage was arranged for her. Gisela had minimal contact with her mother throughout her childhood. Elizabeth, still struggling with her grief over Sophie's birth and separation, was emotionally unavailable even for her second daughter. Gisela saw her mother only during formal, supervised visits. There was no genuine maternal bond, no sense that her mother truly knew her or cared deeply about her welfare. Gisela, like her sister, learned to accept that her mother was a beautiful but distant figure in her life. By her early 20s, Gisela too was married off to a foreign prince. She married King Leopold II of Belgium, a man who would become infamous in history for his brutal exploitation of the Congo and the millions of Africans who died under his colonial rule. Leopold II was a man of profound ambition, ruthlessness, and deeply questionable morality. He had no genuine love or respect for his young bride. Gisela was merely another tool in his collection, a means of strengthening Belgian royal prestige and producing heirs. Gisela bore Leopold 3 children, but her marriage was marked by constant unhappiness. Leopold was involved in numerous affairs. He was emotionally cold and distant. He ruled Belgium with an iron fist and pursued his colonial ambitions with single-minded ruthlessness. Gisela found herself in a foreign court, separated from her family, married to a man she did not love, unable to escape the role that had been assigned to her at birth. She spent her life trying to adapt to life in Belgium, trying to be a good wife and queen, never finding genuine happiness or fulfillment. Like her mother before her, Gisela experienced her own psychological struggles. She developed health problems. She struggled with depression and anxiety. She felt trapped and helpless, much as her mother had felt trapped and helpless in Vienna. The cycle of suffering continued from generation to generation. Mothers separated from daughters, daughters separated from their own children, all in service to the relentless demands of the dynasty. Both Sophie and Gisela would live long lives by the standards of their era, Sophie dying in 1935 at 80 years old. Gisela dying in 1932 at 76, but neither ever escaped the shadow of their mother, the control of their grandmother, or the rigid constraints of the Habsburg system that had defined their existence from birth. Elizabeth, consumed with her own pain and desperation, and increasingly focused on escape attempts and her obsession with maintaining her physical beauty, was unable to provide her daughters with genuine maternal affection or meaningful support. She could not break free from the system that had imprisoned her to offer them freedom. She could not give them the emotional warmth and love they desperately needed because she herself had been so damaged by emotional deprivation. Both daughters were treated as dynastic assets rather than as human beings deserving of love, autonomy, and the right to determine their own futures. Both were given away to foreign princes in marriages arranged for political advantage. Both bore children, fulfilled their duties as wives and mothers and queens, yet neither found genuine happiness or fulfillment in their lives. They did not die tragic deaths like their brother would. They did not take their own lives in desperation as Rudolf would, but in their own ways, they were casualties of the Habsburg system just as surely as he was. They were victims of a system that prioritized dynastic power and political advantage over human happiness and well-being. They suffered quietly, without the dramatic tragedy that would surround their brother's death, but they suffered nonetheless. Elizabeth's inability to mother her daughters was not simply a personal failing on her part. Rather, it was a systemic impossibility created by a court structure that denied mothers any real authority or control over their children. It was a system that used women as brood mores and diplomatic commodities, rather than as human beings capable of love and connection. And that system destroyed not just Elizabeth, but all four of her children, each in different ways, each carrying the wounds of maternal separation and emotional deprivation throughout their entire lives. Chapter 7. The Flight from Reality. By the 1860s, Elizabeth's mental and physical health was deteriorating rapidly. She suffered from depression, anxiety, and what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress from her forced separations from her children. She developed a passionate obsession with beauty and appearance, spending hours maintaining her weight and her complexion, as if her physical beauty was the only thing she could control. She began taking long trips away from Vienna, ostensibly for her health, but really as an escape from the suffocating court environment. She traveled to Italy, to Greece, to Egypt. She rode horses obsessively, sometimes for 6 or 7 hours a day, pushing her body to extremes in what some historians interpret as a form of self-harm. She began writing poetry, much of it dark and melancholic. She started studying foreign languages with intense focus. These activities gave her the illusion of control over her life, something she desperately needed. Franz Joseph, initially hurt and confused by his wife's increasingly distant behavior, eventually came to accept that Elizabeth needed freedom and space. He was a man of duty, not imagination, and while he loved Elizabeth in his way, he did not understand her need to escape. As Elizabeth grew more distant, Franz Joseph sought emotional comfort elsewhere, beginning affairs that were discreetly tolerated by court society. Elizabeth's children, growing up during these years, saw their mother only occasionally. Rudolph, the crown prince, saw his mother rarely. When they did meet, they were awkward, formal encounters. The deep maternal bond that Elizabeth had craved simply did not exist. Instead, there was a kind of polite distance, a recognition that they shared blood, but not truly a family. The tragedy of this situation cannot be overstated. Elizabeth wanted desperately to be a mother to her children, but the imperial system had denied her that role. By the time she might have rebelled against the Archduchess's authority, it was too late. The children did not know her. They did not feel connected to her. She was a beautiful stranger who occasionally appeared and then disappeared again. The pain of this was unbearable for Elizabeth. Chapter 8. Crown Prince Rudolph, the Tragic Heir. Crown Prince Rudolph was born into a position of almost unimaginable pressure. From his first breath, his life was not his own but belonged to the empire. Every detail of his education was prescribed. Every moment of his day was orchestrated. He was trained to be emperor from childhood, yet his preparation was rigid, joyless, and focused entirely on duty with little regard for his psychological well-being. Rudolph's relationship with his parents was deeply troubled. His father, Franz Joseph, was a cold, distant figure who ruled through fear and duty. Franz Joseph believed in strict discipline and emotional restraint. He showed affection through control, not warmth. His mother, Elisabeth, was largely absent, pursuing her escapes and obsessions. Rudolph saw very little of her. The combination created a deeply lonely boy who desperately craved genuine affection, but received instead only formal recognition of his position. Rudolph was an intelligent, sensitive child. He loved science, philosophy, and writing. He had his mother's romantic inclinations and his father's sense of duty, but the two pulled in opposite directions within him. As he grew older, Rudolph became aware of the contradictions in the Habsburg world, the rigid tradition, The obsession with protocol and honor, the underlying dishonesty and hypocrisy. He became increasingly troubled by what he saw, a beautiful exterior hiding moral decay. As a young man, Rudolf was charming, intelligent, and liberal in his thinking, progressive for his time, interested in science, medicine, and social reform. But he was also depressed, increasingly given to melancholy, and deeply troubled by the weight of his position. He wrote extensively in his diaries about his unhappiness, about his sense that life was meaningless, about his fear of becoming like his father, cold, distant, emotionally dead. By the 1880s, Rudolf was displaying all the signs of severe clinical depression. He struggled with what he himself described as a loss of will to live. He questioned the meaning of existence. He wrote darkly about suicide. These were not the musings of a moody young man, but the desperate cries of someone in genuine psychological agony. Chapter 9. Rudolf's Marriage and Descent. In 1881, Rudolf married Princess Stephanie of Belgium, another arranged marriage designed to strengthen political alliances. Stephanie was young, innocent, and had married the crown prince, expecting love and companionship. Instead, she married a deeply troubled man who was emotionally unavailable, prone to depression, and incapable of genuine intimacy due to his traumatic upbringing. Rudolf and Stephanie's marriage was unhappy almost from the beginning. Rudolf was unable to be the husband Stephanie needed. He sought emotional solace in affairs with other women, including the actress Mizzy Casper, and most fatefully with Baroness Mary Witzera, a young noblewoman 13 years his junior. With Mary, Rudolf believed he had found true love, someone who understood him, someone who would validate his existence beyond his role as crown prince. But this affair was not simply a romantic escapade. By the 1880s, Rudolf was deeply suicidal. His diaries from this period reveal a man in profound psychological agony. He wrote about the meaninglessness of existence, about the horror of the world, about his conviction that life was not worth living. He struggled with what doctors today would recognize as severe clinical depression, a condition for which there was no treatment in his era. He was utterly alone with his suffering, unable to confide in anyone, unable to find help. In his diaries, Rudolf wrote of his desire for death, his hatred of his position, his revulsion at the life he was expected to live. He wrote about his contempt for his father, whom he saw as a cold, emotionless automaton. He wrote about his love for Mary Witzera, who seemed to be the only person who could make him feel alive. But he also wrote about the impossibility of his situation. He could never truly be with Mary, could never escape his responsibilities, could never live authentically. Rudolf's father, Franz Joseph, became aware of his son's relationship with Mary Witzera and his emotional instability, and rather than offering compassionate support, he responded with stern disapproval and threats. In January 1889, Franz Joseph confronted Rudolf about his relationship with Mary Witzera and demanded it end immediately. The confrontation was cold, judgmental, and utterly devoid of parental understanding or love. Franz Joseph saw his son's depression as weakness, his romantic feelings as dereliction of duty, his emotional crisis as a failure of character. On January 30th, 1889, Crown Prince Rudolf and his lover Mary Witzera were found dead in a hunting lodge called Mayerling in the Vienna woods. The official story was that Rudolf, in a moment of passion, had shot Mary and then turned the gun on himself in a murder-suicide. However, the true circumstances were immediately obscured by the imperial court. The bodies were hastily removed. Evidence was destroyed. The truth was buried beneath layers of official denial and spin. Most historians now believe that Rudolf deliberately killed both himself and Mary Witzera, who was a willing participant in what he saw as a romantic escape from the unbearable prison of his life. He died with Mary, the one person he believed truly loved him. In death, he found the peace that life could never give him. The scandal was absolutely devastating to the imperial family. Rudolf, the heir to the throne, the man groomed since birth to rule the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was dead. Moreover, he had killed himself, which in the heavily Catholic Empire was an unforgivable sin. The Habsburg succession was shattered. The empire faced a constitutional crisis. And for Elizabeth, the news was an earthquake that would tear apart whatever remained of her ability to function. The grief that consumed Elizabeth was absolute and all-encompassing. Her only son, the child she had been forced to surrender immediately after his birth, had chosen death over life. What tormented her most was the question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Could she have saved him if she had been a real mother to him? Could she have prevented this tragedy if she had not been absent? If she had fought harder against the Archduchess's control? If she had given him the maternal love he so desperately needed? The answer to these questions was unknowable, but Elizabeth could not stop asking them. She had spent her life separated from her children by forces beyond her control. Now, her only son was dead because of psychological damage caused by that very same system of separation and emotional coldness. The guilt was crushing. The remorse was unbearable. Elizabeth's already fragile mental state shattered completely. She aged rapidly in the months following Rudolph's death. Her obsessive physical regimen intensified. She began wearing only black. She composed an elegy to her dead son that reveals the depth of her remorse and anguish. She withdrew even further from public life and from what remained of her family. In many ways, Elizabeth died at Mayerling too. Her body lived on, but her spirit was broken beyond repair. Chapter 10. After Mayerling, The Lost Years. The decade following Rudolph's death was a slow spiritual death for Elizabeth. She was only 52 years old when she lost her son, but she aged as if decades had passed in the months following his suicide. Her beauty, which had been her defining characteristic and her only source of power, began to fade despite her obsessive efforts to maintain it. She wore veils and concealing clothing, unable to bear being seen in public. She cut off nearly all her magnificent hair, which had once been her crowning glory, as if she wished to destroy the very thing that had made her an empress. Elizabeth's already extreme exercise regimen became more intense and obsessive. She would spend 8 hours a day riding or walking, pushing her increasingly fragile body to its limits. She barely ate. She became skeletal. Her doctors warned her that she was destroying her health, but she seemed indifferent to their warnings. In many ways, her physical self-punishment was a continuation of the suicide that had consumed Rudolph. She did not pull a trigger, but she was slowly killing herself through deprivation and excessive exercise. She traveled constantly, moving from place to Corfu, to France, to Switzerland, to Hungary. She was running, always running, trying to escape the ghosts that pursued her. She spent millions of the state budget on these travels and on the maintenance of her estates, but Franz Joseph, now an old man himself, did not object. He too was broken by Rudolph's death. He understood in his limited way that his wife needed these escapes. Elizabeth's relationship with her surviving children remained distant and formal. Gisela was living in Belgium. Sophie was with her husband in Naples. Elizabeth rarely saw them. They were not close. The bond of maternal love that should have held them together simply did not exist. Elizabeth had never been given the chance to mother them, and by now she was too broken to try. She lived in what some historians have called a walking death. She was technically still the empress, but she spent almost no time in Vienna. She owned estates throughout the empire, and she lived a kind of phantom existence, moving between them, always seeking something that could never be found: peace, redemption, her lost children. Chapter 11. The Final Tragedy, Elizabeth's Assassination. In September 1898, Elizabeth was in Geneva, Switzerland, staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage. She had planned to take a walk along the waterfront of Lake Geneva. She was 60 years old, still beautiful despite her emaciation, still maintaining her obsessive commitment to exercise and appearance. She was walking alone, as was her custom, lost in her own dark thoughts. A young anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, who had come to Geneva with vague intentions of assassinating someone of importance to make a political statement, encountered Elizabeth on the waterfront. He did not initially recognize her as the Empress, but when he realized who she was, he stabbed her with a needle-like file, piercing her heart. It happened so quickly that Elizabeth barely had time to realize what was occurring. She continued walking for a few moments before collapsing. The assassination was shocking, not primarily because Elizabeth was a beloved empress. She had been mostly absent from Vienna for decades, and was not particularly popular, but because it seemed like the final, almost poetic conclusion to her tragic life. She had been running from pain her entire life, always fleeing, always escaping. Now, in an instant, the running had stopped. The pain that had pursued her since the day her newborn children were torn from her. Arms had finally caught up and taken her. Elizabeth was brought to the hospital where she was attended by doctors. For a few moments before she died, she asked what had happened to her. When she was told she had been stabbed, her only response was a kind of resignation, as if she had almost been expecting something like this all along. She died quickly within hours, too quickly to even say goodbye to Franz Joseph, too quick to reconcile with anyone, too quick to find any peace. Her death was front-page news throughout Europe, but the public mourning was curiously muted. She had been absent from public life for so long that many people hardly knew her. She had been separated from the throne by nearly 2 decades of isolation and escape. The woman who was killed on the shores of Lake Geneva was not the woman Vienna had known, but rather a ghost, a shadow, a living symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the Habsburg dynasty. Chapter 12. The Cycle of Tragedy. When we examine Elizabeth's story and the fates of her 4 children, a devastating pattern emerges. None of her children died of natural causes in childhood, as was so common in the 19th century. Rather, each of them suffered profoundly from the psychological damage of the imperial system and from Elizabeth's own emotional incapacity, a capacity destroyed by the forced separation from them at birth and by her utter helplessness against the Archduchess Sophie's control. Sophie suffered a life of unhappiness, trapped in a loveless marriage to King Ferdinand, the second of the 2 Sicilies, and constrained by rigid protocol. She produced heirs as expected, but experienced miscarriage and child loss. She never escaped the rigid confines that had defined her life from birth. She lived 80 years, but was never truly happy, never truly free, never truly loved as a human being, rather than as a dynastic commodity. Gisela also lived a life of profound unhappiness, married to Leopold II of Belgium, and unable to escape the role destiny had assigned her. Like her sister, she never received the maternal affection she deserved. She too was locked within her position, unable to live authentically. She bore children, fulfilled her dynastic role, but her own personal happiness was sacrificed on the altar of imperial power. Rudolf, the only son, the heir to an empire, was destroyed by the psychological weight of his position and the emotional coldness of his upbringing. He grew up virtually motherless and fatherless, educated into a role but never nurtured as a human being. He became depressed, suicidal, and ultimately took his own life rather than live another day in the suffocating world that had been assigned to him. His tragedy was the most dramatic, but it was merely the most visible manifestation of the damage caused by the imperial system to all 4 of Elizabeth's children. And Elizabeth herself was a casualty of this same system. She had been a spirited, romantic girl who had married for love. only to find herself trapped in a role that denied her the most basic human right, the right to mother her own children. The psychological damage was immense and permanent. She spent the rest of her life trying to escape the pain, first through obsessive physical regimens, then through travel and isolation, and finally through a kind of passive acceptance of death when it came. Chapter 13. Legacy and Lessons. The life of Empress Elisabeth and the tragic fates of her 4 children offer profound lessons that remain relevant today. First, her story is a devastating critique of a system that treated human beings, especially women and children, as dynastic assets rather than as people deserving of love and autonomy. The Habsburg system, with its rigid protocols and complete denial of individual agency, was designed to perpetuate power at the cost of human happiness and psychological well-being. Second, Elizabeth's life demonstrates the long-term psychological damage caused by forced separation of mothers and infants. Modern psychology has validated what many of us intuitively understand, that the bond between mother and child is fundamental to human development. The Archduchess Sophie's practice of immediately removing newborns from their mother's care, while considered proper and appropriate in 19th century court circles, was psychologically devastating. The damage rippled through generations, causing suffering not only to Elizabeth, but to her children and to everyone around them. Third, Elizabeth's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of using beauty and physical appearance as sources of identity and power. Elizabeth had been chosen by the emperor because of her beauty. She had spent decades obsessively maintaining that beauty, as if her appearance was all she had to offer. When age and grief destroyed that beauty, she seemed to lose her will to live. This teaches us that physical beauty is fundamentally unstable and insufficient as a foundation for identity. Fourth, her life illustrates the dangers of emotional coldness and the inability to express love in families of privilege. Franz Joseph loved Elizabeth in his limited way, but he could not give her the emotional support she desperately needed. He could not comfort her after the loss of her children. He could not break through the rigid protocols that separated them. Their marriage was a tragedy not of passion, but of emotional disconnection. What Elizabeth needed was not grand gestures, but simple human warmth and understanding, something that the imperial system made impossible. Fifth, Elizabeth's life demonstrates how depression and suicidal ideation can run through families. Rudolph, who inherited his mother's romantic idealism, but combined it with his father's emotional coldness, became suicidal. Elizabeth herself seemed to engage in slow suicide through her obsessive self-deprivation and her dismissal of her own safety. Neither had access to adequate mental health treatment, a situation that would begin to change only in the 20th century. Their story is a testament to the tragedy of mental illness when it goes unrecognized and untreated. Chapter 14. The Myth vs. the Reality. In recent decades, Elizabeth has been transformed into a romantic icon, the beautiful empress who escaped the rigid confines of court life, who defied convention, who remained eternally youthful and beautiful despite her sorrows. Popular culture, especially the musical Elizabeth and various films, has romanticized her story, turning it into something approaching a fairy tale, in which the beautiful heroine suffers nobly but retains her tragic dignity. But the real Elizabeth is far more tragic and far less romantic. She was not a rebel who successfully escaped imperial constraints. Rather, she was a woman utterly destroyed by those constraints, who spent her later years living a kind of living death. Her obsessions with beauty and youth were not charming eccentricities, but symptoms of profound psychological trauma. Her endless traveling was not adventurous, but symptomatic of an inability to find peace or safety anywhere. Her estrangement from her children was not a matter of choice, but of helplessness. The romantic myth of Elizabeth, the myth that has captured popular imagination, does her life a disservice. It reduces her suffering to something beautiful and meaningful. The reality is that Elizabeth's suffering was senseless, the result of a system that treated her and her children as expendable pieces in a game of dynastic power. The real tragedy of Elizabeth is not her beauty or her romance, but the systematic destruction of her capacity for happiness and maternal love. Chapter 15. The Price of the Crown. The life of Empress Elisabeth Sisi is one of history's great tragedies. She was a beautiful, intelligent, sensitive girl who married a powerful emperor, expecting to find love and happiness. Instead, she found herself trapped in a system that denied her the right to mother her own children, that demanded she produce heirs while giving her no control over them, that forced her to watch her only son descend into depression and ultimately take his own life. All four of her children suffered profoundly. Sophie and Gisela lived constrained, unhappy lives, never able to escape the role of imperial princess. They produced the required heirs, but never experienced genuine happiness or authentic human connection. Rudolph, the only son, the heir to an empire, was so psychologically damaged by his upbringing that he chose death over continuing to live. And Elizabeth herself, having lost her children at the moment of birth, spent the rest of her life in a kind of grief-stricken fugue, running from place to place, trying to escape the pain that could never be escaped. What makes Elizabeth's story so relevant today is that it is not unique. Millions of women have been forced into roles that denied them agency and autonomy. Millions of children have been separated from their mothers for reasons of class, convention, or circumstance. The trauma that Elizabeth experienced is echoed in countless other lives throughout history and in the present day. Her story is not merely historical curiosity. It is a testament to the enduring power of rigid systems to destroy human happiness and to the fundamental human need for maternal love and emotional connection. In the end, Elizabeth's life was not triumphant or beautiful. It was a tragedy from beginning to end. A beautiful girl who fell in love became a broken woman destroyed by circumstance and system. Her children, instead of experiencing the security and love they deserved, experienced isolation, emotional coldness, and psychological damage. Her husband, the emperor of a great power, was unable to provide the emotional support his wife desperately needed. And the empire that demanded so much sacrifice received, in exchange, only suffering and tragedy. The story of Empress Elisabeth teaches us that no crown is worth the destruction of human happiness. No dynasty is worth the sacrifice of mothers and children. No system of honor and protocol is worth the crushing of the human spirit. Elizabeth's life and the tragic fates of her 4 children stand as monuments to the immeasurable cost of prioritizing power and position over love and human connection. Her story ended in 1898 on the shores of Lake Geneva with a single thrust of a knife. But the story of what she represents, the struggle between individual humanity and systemic power, between the desire for love and the demands of duty, between the person we are and the role we are forced to play, continues to resonate through the centuries. Elizabeth's life was a tragedy, but it is a tragedy that demands to be remembered and understood. For in understanding her suffering, we understand something fundamental about ourselves and about the human condition. The woman who had everything had nothing. The empress who ruled an empire could not control her own life. The mother who gave birth to 4 children never truly mothered any of them. And the beauty that had captivated an emperor could not protect her from the darkness that consumed her. Such is the story of Empress Elisabeth Sisi, a life of extraordinary privilege that became a life of extraordinary pain.